Statistics say that during a robbery, 90% of victims experience a heart rate spike of over 180 beats per minute. They panic, they scream, they beg. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, inside a rundown diner in South Boston, Zoraide Vance did none of those things. When a gun barrel was pressed against her forehead, she didn't flinch, she didn't blink. She simply asked if they wanted their coffee to go. It was the coldest thing anyone in the room had ever seen. And watching from the shadows of the back booth was the one man dangerous enough to fall in love with it. The fluorescent lights of Miller's all-night diner hummed with an irritating buzz that usually drove new customers to the edge of madness. For Zoraide Vance, it was just the monotonous soundtrack of a life she had stopped trying to escape. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the rain was hammering against the plate glass windows, turning the streets of South Boston into a blurred smear of neon and charcoal. Zoraide adjusted her apron, wiping a stubborn coffee ring off the Formica counter with a rag that had seen better years. She was only 26, but her eyes looked older, tired, detached, and utterly devoid of the sparkle people expected from a woman her age. She had been working at Miller's for 3 years because it paid her rent in Dorchester, and more importantly, because it made her invisible. Nobody looked twice at a waitress in a greased uniform, and that was exactly how she liked it. There were only 3 tables occupied in the dimly lit space. In the far corner, old man Henderson was nursing a decaf, asleep with his mouth slightly open. By the window, a young couple was arguing in hushed, tearful whispers. And in the back booth, booth 4, the one with the torn red vinyl, sat a man who hadn't touched a single bite of his food. Zoraide had noticed him the moment he stepped out of the rain. He wore a charcoal gray suit that likely cost more than the diner's annual revenue, tailored to a terrifying perfection. He had dark hair and eyes the color of burnt espresso, and he sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. When Zoraide walked over with the coffee pot to offer a refill, he looked up. His eyes didn't just scan her, they dismantled her, peeling back the layers of her defensive indifference. "Black," he said, his voice a low rumble like tires on gravel. As she poured the steaming liquid, she noticed his hands. No watch, no ring, but the knuckles of his right hand bore the faint white scars of a man who knew how to strike. She walked back to the counter, checking the clock. 2:18 a.m. That was when the bell above the door jingled, not with the soft chime of a regular, but with a violent force that slammed the wood against the plaster. 3 men burst in wearing ski masks and soaking wet hoodies. The one in the middle brandished a snub-nosed revolver that trembled in his grip, while his companions gripped a crowbar in a twitching, drug-fueled desperation. "Everybody down on the ground now," the leader screamed, his voice raw and cracked. Zoraide didn't gasp. She didn't drop the coffee pot. She simply set it down on the warmer, clicked the switch to low, and turned around slowly. The gunmen marched up to the counter, shoving the cold metal barrel of the gun into Zoraide's cheekbone. It smelled of gun oil and rust. "I said get on the ground, bitch!" he shrieked, sweat dripping from beneath his mask. Zoraide didn't flinch. She leaned her hip against the counter and crossed her arms, her voice flat and monotone as it cut through the panic. "Register's open," she said, looking directly into his pupils. "Take the cash. Leave the tip jar. The tips are ours." The gunman froze, clearly expecting screams or begging. He pressed the gun harder into her face, hissing, "You think this is a joke? I'll blow your head off." In the back booth, Jun-Ho shifted, his hand sliding beneath his jacket. But Zoraide's eyes flickered to him for a fraction of a second, a micro-signal that commanded him to stay his hand. "Your safety is on," Zoraide said, her voice sounding almost bored. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The gunman frowned, his eyes darting down to his weapon. "It's a Sig Sauer P229 copy," she continued with terrifying conviction. "The safety is the lever on the side. By the time you figure that out, the cops will be here because I hit the silent alarm 3 minutes ago." It was a lie, but she said it with such absolute coldness that the air left the room. She reached under the counter, making the men flinch, but she only pulled out a pack of cigarettes. As she lit one and exhaled smoke toward the ceiling, the distant wail of a siren began to grow. Pure, lucky timing. "Go," she commanded. The 3 men scrambled, tripping over their own feet as they fled back into the rain. Zoraide watched them go, her hands perfectly steady as she picked up the coffee pot to resume her rounds. She felt a presence behind her and turned to find the man from booth 4 looming over her. "You lied," Jun-Ho said softly, his espresso eyes searching for a crack in her armor. "About the safety. If he had pulled the trigger, you would be dead." Zoraide met his gaze, her eyes dark and hollow. "He didn't know that," she replied, "and I don't have enough energy left to be afraid." The aftermath of the robbery didn't arrive with a bang, but with the persistent, invasive glow of a smartphone screen. By noon the following day, the footage captured by a trembling patron near the window had amassed millions of views, and Zoraide Vance was no longer invisible. The internet had dubbed her the Ice Queen of South Boston, a title she loathed because it implied she was brave, when in reality she was simply hollow. She sat on her sagging mattress in her Dorchester studio, watching the video of her own face, flat, detached, and unimpressed by the gun barrel, flicker across the screen. The comments were a cesspool of admiration and conspiracy, but for Zoraide, the viral fame felt like a target painted on her back. Her phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Miller, the diner owner, whose voice was thin and strained with a cowardice she recognized instantly. He didn't thank her for saving his register. He spoke of liability, insurance premiums, and the news crews currently blocking his entrance. He told her not to come in for her shift or any shift thereafter, citing that she provoked the gunman. He offered 2 weeks' pay to be rid of the heat she brought, effectively casting her back into the shadows she had worked so hard to maintain. Zoraide stared at the ceiling as the rain began to lash against her window, the gray light of the afternoon, doing nothing to warm the drafty room. She was 26 years old, unemployed, and the primary source of funding for her mother's memory care facility in New Jersey, a bill that was due in 3 days. The invisible life she had built was crumbling, exposed by a 30-second clip of a man who didn't know how to use a safety lever. She felt the familiar, cold weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. The world didn't like outliers, and it certainly didn't like women who didn't scream when they were supposed to. She stood up, moving to the small kitchenette to count her remaining cash, her movements mechanical and precise. She had enough for a week of groceries, but the facility's costs were a mountain she couldn't climb with waitressing tips. The panic should have set in, the 180 beats per minute the statistics promised, but her heart remained a steady, dull thud in her chest. The lock on her door didn't click. It breathed, a subtle mechanical sigh that told her she wasn't alone before she even turned around. Zoraide didn't scream. She reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet on the counter, her fingers wrapping around the handle with a lethal intent inherited from a man who had died in a prison cell. But she stopped when she saw him. Sitting in her only armchair, a thrift store velvet piece that looked like a joke beneath his presence, was the man from booth 4. Jun-Ho looked even more dangerous in the dim light of her apartment than he had in the diner. He had shed his overcoat, appearing in a crisp white shirt that highlighted the scarred knuckles resting on his knees. Behind him, a massive man with a broken nose stood by the window, his silhouette blocking the meager light. Jun-Ho didn't apologize for the intrusion. He watched her with those espresso eyes, dismantling her apartment the way he had dismantled her soul the night before. "Your lock is a suggestion, Zoraide, not a barrier," Jun-Ho said, his voice a low, textured rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He held up a black business card with gold embossing, the Onyx Lounge, and placed it on the coffee table. He told her he knew she had been fired, admitting with a chilling nonchalance that he had made the call to Miller himself to ensure she was available. He didn't offer an apology, he offered a lifeline. He spoke of a floor manager position at his club in the Seaport District, a place where her detached observation wasn't a liability, but an elite asset. He mentioned the salary, $3,000 a week, cash, and then he mentioned the name of the facility in New Jersey where her mother lived. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees as Zoraide realized the depth of his investigation. He wasn't just offering a job, he was offering a partnership built on the leverage of her only weakness. He stood up, moving into her personal space with a predatory grace that made her breath hitch, not from fear, but from the recognition of a fellow monster. "You're wasted in a diner, Zoraide," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "Work for me, and your mother never has to worry about a bill again. Welcome to the family." The Onyx Lounge was not a club. It was a cathedral built to the worship of vice, a sprawling expanse of matte black brick and velvet the color of dried blood. Located on the jagged edge of the Seaport District, it occupied a renovated industrial warehouse where the lighting was kept low enough to hide sins, but bright enough to count money. Zoraide adjusted the cuffs of her new blazer, her fingers tracing the fine silk of a blouse that cost more than her previous month's wages. Jun-Ho had provided a generous stipend for her wardrobe, but she had chosen her own armor, tailored black trousers and a fitted jacket that commanded a distinction the help rarely received. She stood near the host stand, her eyes moving with a habit ingrained since childhood, scanning for exits, potential aggressors, and lines of sight. She looked like a CEO rather than a cocktail waitress, a necessary transformation because in a place like this, if you looked like the furniture, you were treated like it. It was her fourth night as the floor manager, and the learning curve had been steep and unforgiving. Zoraide had spent the daylight hours memorizing the faces of the Boston elite, city councilors who needed their receipts vague, and union leaders who required private booths away from prying eyes. She had to recognize the captains of Jun-Ho's organization, men who demanded absolute deference and carried themselves with a quiet, lethal weight. "You stand like a soldier," a voice rumbled near her ear. Zoraide didn't jump. She turned slowly to find Jun-Ho standing beside her, his tuxedo unbuttoned at the collar and his eyes weary but intense. "I stand like someone who doesn't want to get knocked over," she replied, her attention already shifting back to the floor. She informed him that Table 6 needed a refill and that a senator in Booth 2 was getting handsy with a server. "I'm about to cut him off," she added flatly. Jun-Ho chuckled low in his throat, warning her that Senator Mitchell had been drinking there since his father ran the place and believed he owned the city. "He can own the city, but he doesn't own the staff," Zoraide said coolly before walking away, moving through the crowd with a fluid, purposeful grace. She approached the booth where the red-faced politician was gripping the wrist of a young waitress named Chloe, who looked terrified. Zoraide didn't make a scene or raise her voice. She simply placed a glass of water on the table with a sharp, echoing clack that cut through the senator's drunken haze. "Senator," she said, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of chilling finality, "your car is out front." When he slurred a protest and asked who she was, Zoraide leaned in, placing her weight on the table and narrowing her gaze. "I'm the woman who decides if those photos of you snorting cocaine in the bathroom 10 minutes ago make it to the Globe tomorrow morning," she whispered. The senator froze, his grip on Chloe's wrist instantly loosening. There were no photos. Zoraide hadn't even seen him go to the bathroom, but she knew that men like Mitchell always had something to hide and assumed the world was watching. It was a bluff, calculated and cold, and it worked with devastating efficiency. The politician scrambled up, threw a handful of cash on the table, and practically ran toward the exit. Zoraide signaled for Chloe to take 10 minutes in the break room, promising to cover the section herself. When she returned to her post, Jun-Ho was waiting with a glass of champagne, noting that she bluffed well. "Who said I was bluffing?" she asked, taking the glass but not drinking. "You have cameras in the bathrooms. I just assumed you were recording." Jun-Ho's expression tightened with a mixture of respect and wariness, calling her observant and dangerous. Zoraide simply met his eyes, her heart beating with the same steady, hollow thud she had felt in the diner. Gemini said, the velvet atmosphere of the Onyx Lounge was beginning to settle into its midnight rhythm, a low-frequency hum of jazz and whispered conspiracies that masked the clinking of expensive crystal. Zoraide stood at the edge of the VIP balcony, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with a predator's precision, looking for the minute shifts in body language that signaled trouble. She was no longer just a ghost in a grease-stained uniform. She was a silhouette of tailored authority, her black blazer serving as a modern suit of armor. The adrenaline from the confrontation with the senator had receded, leaving behind the familiar, hollow calm that had become her sanctuary. It was in this stillness that she felt the shift in the air, a familiar weight of presence that signaled Jun-Ho was near. He didn't approach with the heavy footfalls of his enforcers. He moved like a shadow returning to its origin, silent and absolute. He stepped up beside her, leaning his forearms against the cold brass railing, his eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the club's neon signs. For a long moment, they watched the floor together, a king and his new commander overseeing a domain built on the fragile peace of the underworld. The senator's driver said he was shaking when he reached the car, Jun-Ho remarked, his voice a textured rumble that bypassed the noise of the crowd. He turned his head slightly, his espresso eyes searching her profile for the crack in the porcelain he knew must exist. You didn't just scare him, Zoraide. You dismantled his reality. Where does a waitress learn to look at a man and see exactly where the knife will slide in? Zoraide didn't look away from the floor, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the glass in her hand. My father didn't just teach me about safety levers, she whispered, the confession feeling like a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. He taught me that every man has a script, a way they expect the world to react to their power. If you stop following the script, they lose their place on the page. She finally turned to meet Jun-Ho's gaze. The red light of the lounge, catching the exhaustion she usually kept buried beneath layers of professional detachment. He was a detective before he was a convict. I spent my childhood watching him read people like they were crime scenes. I'm not a waitress, Jun-Ho. I'm a collection of everything he broke before he left. Jun-Ho reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before his thumb brushed against the edge of her jaw. The contact was electric, a sudden grounding wire that connected her to the present moment with a ferocity that made her breath hitch. He didn't pull back when he felt her tremble. Instead, he stepped closer, invading the personal space she had spent years defending with ironclad indifference. We are the same, you and I, he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that was more terrifying than his anger. The world looks at us and sees a boss and a manager, but they don't see the shadows we carry. You aren't just surviving, Zoraide. You are waiting for someone to recognize that you've already burned your own house down. In that moment, the high-gloss facade of the Onyx Lounge seemed to fall away, leaving only two people standing in the ruins of their own histories. Zoraide looked at his scarred knuckles, the white marks of a man who had fought his way out of his own darkness, and saw the reflection of her own soul. She wasn't afraid of the gun oil or the rust anymore. She was afraid of the way his recognition made her feel alive, a sensation more dangerous than any bullet. Why me? She asked, her voice barely audible over the rising swell of the saxophone below. Why pull me out of the diner? Jun-Ho's gaze intensified, a predatory and possessive fire lighting in his eyes. Because I've spent my life surrounded by people who are afraid to die, he said. I wanted to see what would happen if I hired someone who was already dead. I wanted a partner who could walk through the fire without blinking. I found you, Zoraide. The vulnerability between them was a jagged, uncomfortable thing, a shared secret that bound them tighter than the cash or the mother's medical bills ever could. Zoraide realized then that she hadn't been saved. She had been recruited into a war that was as much about her own identity as it was about territory. She reached up, her hand covering his on her face, her skin a sharp contrast against his. I'm not a waitress, she repeated, this time with a chilling certainty that signaled her final transformation. And I'm done serving. If we're going to burn this city, Jun-Ho, I want to be the one holding the match. He smiled then, a genuine, dangerous expression that promised a future of blood and gold. Good, he said, because the match is already lit. The peaceful atmosphere of the Onyx Lounge shattered at precisely 11 p.m., not with a scream, but with a sudden, localized drop in the room's temperature. The front doors swung open, and a group of 4 men walked in with a heavy, rhythmic arrogance that signaled a breach in the club's sanctuary. The music didn't stop, and the conversations continued, but the air grew thin, and the Santoro soldiers stationed near the velvet-draped pillars stiffened, their hands instinctively drifting toward the concealed weights of their jackets. Leading the group was a man Zoraide recognized from the digital dossiers Jun-Ho had made her study until her eyes burned. Marco Vane, the underboss of the Moretti family, was a man who wore a white suit that screamed for attention and a reputation for a brand of violence that lacked Jun-Ho's strategic restraint. Marco was young, reckless, and loud, a predator who preferred the spectacle of the kill over the efficiency of the hunt. He marched past the host stand, intentionally ignoring Zoraide as if she were a ghost, and grabbed a bottle of premium vodka from a passing server's tray. With a casual flick of his wrist, he took a swig and then smashed the bottle against the floor. Glass shattered, the shards skittering across the polished wood like diamonds in the dark. The music died instantly, and the silence that followed was a suffocating weight. "Oops," Marco grinned, his eyes wide with a drug-fueled glint as he looked toward the shadows where Jun-Ho stood. "Slippery hands, Gabriel. I heard you got a new dog to guard the door. I didn't realize you were hiring help that required a broom." Rocco, Jun-Ho's enforcer, stepped forward, his knuckles white and his face a mask of restrained fury, but Jun-Ho held up a hand. A fight here, in the middle of a legitimate front, would bring the police and the heat they didn't need. Zoraide didn't wait for a command. She walked over to the mess, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, lethal grace that drew every eye in the room. Marco laughed, looking at Jun-Ho with a sneer. "See? They all bow eventually. Get a broom, sweetie. Make it sparkle." Zoraide didn't reach for a broom. She crouched down, her movements fluid and calm, and picked up a large, jagged shard of the broken bottle. It was thick, curved, and honed to a razor edge by the force of the impact. She stood up slowly, but she wasn't holding the glass like trash. She was holding it like a shank, her thumb braced against the base and her fingers curled for a thrust. Before Marco could process the shift in her energy, Zoraide closed the distance between them, invading his personal space with a speed that made his men flinch. She took his hand, the one that had snapped at her, and placed the jagged shard into his palm. She didn't just hand it to him, she closed his fingers over the glass and squeezed with an ironclad grip. The shard bit into his skin, not deep enough to sever a tendon, but deep enough to draw a bright, steady bloom of red. "You dropped this," Zoraide whispered, her face inches from his. Her eyes were dead voids, reflecting nothing but the cold reality of his own mortality. "And in this house, we don't clean up after children. We call their mothers to pick them up." Marco flinched, his pupils dilating with a sudden sharp fear as he tried to pull his hand back, but Zoraide's grip remained absolute. She leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear so the room couldn't hear the clinical destruction of his ego. "Your heart rate is visible in your neck, Marco. Your pupils suggest you're riding a high that will crash in 30 seconds. If you start a fight here, my bouncers won't just throw you out. They'll peel you off the floor like gum. Walk away while you still have a hand to snap with." She released him then, and Marco ripped his hand back, staring at the drop of blood on his palm with genuine shock. He looked at Jun-Ho, who was watching from the shadows with a terrifyingly calm smirk, and then back at the woman who had just dismantled him without raising her voice. "You're crazy," Marco muttered, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He signaled his men, and they retreated into the rainy night, leaving the Onyx Lounge in a state of stunned, reverent silence. Zoraide simply wiped a speck of vodka off her blazer and returned to her post, her pulse never having crossed the threshold of a calm, resting beat. The respect Zoraide had earned after the confrontation with Marco Vane was a heavy, silent thing that followed her through the dark corridors of the Onyx Lounge. The bouncers now moved aside with a sharp nod, and the bartenders anticipated her espresso order before she even reached the mahogany rail, yet she refused to let the comfort settle into her bones. In the world of the Santoro family, comfort was a precursor to a shallow grave, and Zoraide remained a woman of sharp edges and constant surveillance. She spent her nights managing the chaotic energy of the floor and her days visiting her mother at the memory care facility, a place of soft music and manicured gardens that Jun-Ho's money maintained with surgical precision. It was on a rainy Thursday, while reconciling the liquor inventory in the back office, that the polished facade of the organization finally began to crack. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar, and the ventilation system carried the distinct, hushed urgency of a conversation that wasn't meant for her ears. "I'm telling you, I need more," A jittery, high-pitched voice whined, the sound vibrating with a drug-fueled anxiety Zoraide recognized from the diner. "The cops are sniffing around my place, and that waitress, she messed everything up." A deeper, gravelly response followed, one that Zoraide knew belonged to Leo, one of Jun-Ho's lower-level captains who managed the shipping docks. "You got paid for a job you didn't finish," Leo hissed, the flare of a lighter punctuating his irritation. Zoraide froze, her pen hovering over the ledger as she crept toward the door crack. She saw them in the dim hallway. Leo, leaning against the brickwork with a cigarette dangling from his lip, and facing him was the man with the bulging eyes from the robbery, the junkie who had pressed a gun to her face. "You were supposed to wait for Jun-Ho to stand up," Leo continued, his voice dropping to a murderous whisper. "The plan was to clip him in the crossfire of a robbery gone wrong, not flee because a girl scared you with a cigarette." The air in the small office seemed to vanish as the realization settled in Zoraide's chest like lead. The robbery at Miller's Diner hadn't been a random act of desperation. It was a targeted hit on Jun-Ho, orchestrated by his own man. The junkie grabbed a fresh envelope of cash from Leo and bolted toward the back exit, leaving the captain to adjust his jacket and disappear toward the main club floor. Zoraide leaned back against the desk, her breath coming in shallow, controlled gasps. If Leo was a traitor, the inner circle was compromised, and the man who had pulled her out of the shadows was walking into a blind spot. She knew the mathematics of the underworld. Jun-Ho had known Leo for a decade. While she was merely a survivor, he had plucked from a diner a few weeks ago. Without proof, her word was a death sentence for herself, but silence was a death sentence for him. She emerged from the office just as Jun-Ho appeared in the hallway, looking sharp in a midnight blue suit that made him look like a piece of the night itself. "Get your coat," he commanded, his eyes weary but softening for a fraction of a second when they landed on her. He explained they were heading to a private high-stakes poker game in a warehouse in Chelsea, Leo's territory. He wanted her there to serve, and more importantly, to observe, because her eyes were better than his bodyguards. Zoraide's stomach dropped into a cold void. She couldn't tell him yet, not while Leo's men were likely watching their every move, but she couldn't let him go unprotected. She checked her purse, finding that her pepper spray had been replaced by a folding tactical knife she had bought at a surplus store, a small, jagged insurance policy. The drive to Chelsea was a tense, silent affair as rain lashed against the armored windows of the SUV. Rocco drove with a focused intensity while Jun-Ho sat beside Zoraide, his presence a grounding force that she was suddenly terrified of losing. "You're quiet tonight," he noted, his espresso eyes searching hers for the secret she was clutching. "Just thinking about loyalty," Zoraide replied, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "It's a rare currency." Jun-Ho put his phone down, his expression hardening into something ancient and lethal. "It's the only currency, Zoraide. Everything else is just paper." As the warehouse loomed out of the dark, Zoraide realized she was no longer just a floor manager or a survivor. She was the shield, and the man who had recognized her shadows was about to find out exactly how far she would go to protect the only person who had ever truly seen her. The Chelsea warehouse was a cavernous, skeletal space that smelled of stagnant river water and industrial grease. A single heavy lamp hung over the center of the room, casting a brutal cone of light onto a felt-topped poker table, while the rest of the warehouse remained swallowed by predatory shadows. Jun-Ho sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding the dim space, while Leo hovered nearby with a bottle of expensive bourbon and a smile that didn't reach his jittery eyes. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the unspoken threat of the rival bosses gathered there, but Zoraide felt a different kind of tension, the electric hum of a trap about to spring. She stood slightly behind Jun-Ho, holding a silver tray with crystal glasses, her gaze constantly tracking the movement of the men in the periphery and the dark, crisscrossing rafters above their heads. The game proceeded with a deceptive joviality, but Zoraide noticed Leo's hand trembling as he poured a drink, his eyes frequently darting to his watch. She leaned in toward Jun-Ho, pretending to offer more ice, and leaned her weight slightly against the back of his chair. "Check the rafters," she breathed, her lips barely moving as she looked at the three position. The shadows are moving. Jun-Ho didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his cards. Instead, he reached for his glass, using the amber liquid as a mirror to catch the glint of a sniper scope hidden in the darkness above. At that exact moment, Leo stepped back from the table, claiming he needed to hit the head. "Sit down, Leo," Jun-Ho commanded, his voice a low thunderclap that froze the room. "The game isn't over." "Drop the tray," Zoraide screamed, her voice tearing through the silence. She didn't wait for his reaction. She grabbed Jun-Ho by the collar of his tailored suit and yanked him backward with every ounce of her strength. A split second later, a bullet slammed into the center of the poker table, sending wood splinters exploding like shrapnel. Chaos erupted instantly. The other players scrambled for cover, flipping the heavy table to create a barricade. Zoraide and Jun-Ho hit the cold concrete floor hard, Jun-Ho rolling to shield her for a fraction of a second before they both scrambled behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. "Sniper! High ground!" Jun-Ho roared to Rocco, who was already laying down a barrage of suppressing fire from the entrance. More shots rang out, the metallic pings off the concrete floor sounding like a death knell. Gunmen began emerging from the shadows of the crates, their silhouettes flickering in the strobing light of the gunfire. "Leo set you up," Zoraide yelled over the deafening noise. "I heard him talking to the robber. This was an inside job from the start." Jun-Ho looked at her, his espresso eyes blazing with a mixture of raw fury and a new, sharp realization. He pulled a sleek Beretta from his holster, but as he focused on the sniper above, a flanking gunman stepped into the light to their left, raising a rifle at Jun-Ho's exposed back. Zoraide didn't think. She didn't have time for the 180 beats per minute of panic. She lunged forward, sliding across the blood-slicked floor to where a fallen bodyguard had dropped his weapon. Her fingers wrapped around the cold grip of a Glock 19, a weight that felt eerily familiar, a ghost of her father's lessons. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She raised the gun and fired 2 shots with a clinical, perfect form. The flanking gunman dropped instantly, his rifle clattering to the floor. Jun-Ho spun around, his own weapon raised, his face etched with shock as he saw the invisible Waitress standing over the body with a smoking barrel and steady hands. "I told you," Zoraide said, her voice a hollow void of emotion as she scanned the room for the next threat. "I know about the safety." The warehouse had become a slaughterhouse, the air thick with gun smoke and the metallic tang of blood. "Rocco, move to the exit," Jun-Ho commanded, grabbing Zoraide's arm and pulling her into a crouched run. They burst through the side door into the freezing rain, diving into the armored SUV just as the tires screeched against the asphalt. Inside the car, the silence was a crushing weight. Zoraide sat trembling, the adrenaline finally crashing through her system, leaving her hands shaking as she dropped the gun onto the floor mat. Jun-Ho stared at her, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on her face as if seeing her for the very first time. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice thick with an intensity that transcended the war they were in. "You aren't just a waitress, Zoraide. Who taught you to kill like that?" Zoraide looked out at the blurred neon of the city, the rain slicking the windows like tears. "The only person coming to save you is you," she whispered. "My father taught me that before the world broke us both." The armored SUV was a ruin of twisted metal and shattered glass, sitting smoking in a ditch off an exit ramp on I-93. The rain sizzled against the hot engine block, a dying hiss that underscored the absolute silence of the forest surrounding them. Rocco, bleeding from a jagged cut on his forehead but fiercely alive, had shoved a fresh magazine into his submachine gun before disappearing into the tree line to draw the attention of any trailing hit squads. Now, 2 hours later, Zoraide watched the passing blackness of the New Hampshire wilderness from the passenger seat of a nondescript, rust-bucket Ford Taurus, the emergency car Jun-Ho kept for when his world inevitably caught fire. The city lights were a distant, neon memory, replaced by the crushing weight of the pines. Zoraide was dissociating, her mind retreating into the same cold, gray space she used when her father Hather hadn't come home. It was a defense mechanism she knew as intimately as the weight of the Glock now resting beneath her seat. "You're bleeding," Zoraide said, her voice cutting through the hum of the car's heater with the sharpness of a scalpel. Jun-Ho glanced down at his left shoulder, where a dark, spreading stain had turned his dress shirt into a map of the warehouse ambush. A bullet had grazed the muscle, a souvenir of the moment he had tried to shield her. "It's nothing," he grunted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding dirt road toward the lake house. "It's not nothing," she countered, her voice devoid of its usual professional distance. "Pull over." He didn't, pushing the car until they reached a fortress of glass and timber hidden at the end of a 3-mile track. The silence of the woods was louder than the gunfire had been. Inside, the air was freezing until Jun-Ho keyed a code, flickering on minimalist lights that revealed a living room of leather and shadow. He collapsed onto the sofa, the adrenaline finally leaving him in a visible wave of exhaustion. Zoraide didn't wait for him to ask for help. She moved with clinical precision, finding the first aid kit under the kitchen sink, standard placement for a man who lived his life in the crosshairs. She returned to the sofa, grabbed the glass of whiskey he had poured, took a steadying sip herself, and set it down. "Shirt off," she ordered. Jun-Ho looked at her, his face pale and sweat-beaded, but he obeyed, unbuttoning the ruined silk to reveal a torso that was a ledger of his history. There were old scars, jagged knife wounds, and the fresh, angry red mark of the graze. Zoraide soaked a gauze pad in antiseptic. "This is going to burn," she warned, and when she pressed it against the wound, he hissed, his hand gripping the leather armrest until it creaked. She worked in silence, cleaning the blood and applying a butterfly bandage with hands that did not shake. When she finished, she didn't pull away. She remained standing between his knees, her hands resting lightly on his bare chest, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. The proximity was electric, a shared heat in the cold room. "You should have left me at the diner," Zoraide whispered, her eyes fixed on his bandages. Jun-Ho reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck to force her to meet his gaze. His espresso eyes were dark pools of intensity. "If I had left you, you'd be dead. Leo would have cleaned up the loose ends." Zoraide gave a dry, humorless laugh. "I was dead anyway. I've been dead for 3 years, since the day my father went to prison." Jun-Ho's thumb stroked the line of her jaw. "Who was he, Zoraide? A waitress doesn't pick up a Glock and fire center mass without blinking." Zoraide felt the secret she had spent years burying finally claw its way to the surface. "Detective Frank Brooks," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fireplace. "Narcotics. He was a legend in the city, the kind of cop who played both sides so well that no one knew where the law ended and the crime began. He taught me everything: how to strip a weapon, how to read a room, how to recognize the safety on a Sig Sauer before the gunman even knows he's holding it." Jun-Ho stiffened, the name clearly sparking a memory of the old Boston hierarchies. "Brooks was a rat," he said softly, the realization dawning on him. "My father was a survivor," Zoraide snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous anger. "He taught me that the only person coming to save you is you. He died in a cell while I was serving coffee to men who used to pay him off." Jun-Ho didn't pull back. Instead, he cupped her face with both hands, his grip possessive and grounding. "You're wrong," he said. "You're with me now, your family, and in my world, we don't just survive, we strike back." He pulled her down, and this time the kiss was a desperate collision of violence and devotion. It was the taste of whiskey and copper, a magnetic pull that neither of them could resist. For the first time in years, Zoraide didn't feel like the invisible waitress or the detective's disgraced daughter. She felt like fire. "If we get through this, Zoraide," Jun-Ho murmured against her skin as the fire finally caught, "there is no going back to the shadows." "I know," she said, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder. "I've been in the dark long enough." The morning sun hit the lake with a blinding clinical glare that offered no warmth, and by the time Zoraide woke, Jun-Ho was already dressed in black, meticulously checking the magazine of his Beretta. His face was a mask of lethal intent, the vulnerability of the previous night tucked away behind the ironclad requirements of leadership. He informed her that he had called a meeting for that night at the Onyx Lounge, inviting the heads of the 5 families and the traitor, Leo. Zoraide argued that Leo wouldn't show, but Jun-Ho merely offered a grim, predatory smile. He had sent word that he was weak, injured, and ready to surrender his territory. It was the ultimate lure for men built on ambition and blood. The Onyx Lounge had been transformed for the occasion. The velvet tables pushed back to leave a large, open circle where the heads of the New England crime families now sat. Zoraide stood by the mahogany bar, wearing a sleek black dress with a tactical knife strapped to her thigh beneath the silk, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced detachment of a woman who had already seen the end of the world. Leo was there, pacing with a smug, jittery energy, but in the center chair sat the real architect of the chaos, Uncle Sal Moretti, the oldest and most respected don in the city. Sal wore a white carnation in his lapel and watched the proceedings with a bored, kingly indifference. "Cut the crap, Jun-Ho," Leo interrupted, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "Just sign the papers. You're done." But Sal stood up slowly, his voice a raspy whisper that commanded absolute silence. He adjusted his jacket, and in that moment, Zoraide saw it, a bright red handkerchief tucked into his breast pocket. Her mind flashed back to her father's old narcotics case files, the hidden language of the streets that Frank Brooks had whispered to her like bedtime stories. White for peace, red for war. Sal wasn't there to mediate. He had used Leo to weaken Jun-Ho, and now he was going to wipe them both out to seize total control. Zoraide saw the two bartenders, men she hadn't vetted, reach beneath the counter for the heavy steel of shotguns. "Jun-Ho, no," she screamed, but she didn't run for cover. She grabbed a bottle of high-proof rum from the back bar and hurled it with a perfect athletic arc at the nearest overhead light fixture. The bulb shattered, the sparks igniting the alcohol in a brilliant, terrifying fireball that blew out the main circuit breaker. The club plunged into a disorienting darkness, lit only by the strobing, rhythmic pulse of the red emergency lights. "Down!" Jun-Ho roared, the sound of gunfire following instantly as the room dissolved into a symphony of shattering glass and lead. In the flickering strobe light, Zoraide saw Sal standing over a fallen bodyguard, aiming his pistol directly at Jun-Ho's head. He looked demonic in the red pulse, a relic of a violent era refusing to fade. "Smart girl." Sal sneered, his aim steadying for the kill shot. "Too smart for your own good." Jun-Ho tried to reach for his weapon, but he was pinned down by suppressing fire from the bar. Zoraide didn't hesitate. A shotgun lay on the floor 5 feet away, dropped by a wounded bartender, and she dove for it. She rolled across the slick, alcohol-drenched floor, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel. She pumped the action, a heavy, mechanical chunk that sounded like the closing of a tomb. She was on her back, sliding through the glass, as she raised the barrel toward the man in the white carnation. Sal hesitated, his eyes meeting hers, and for a split second, he didn't see a waitress. He saw the same icy, hollow void that had terrified the robbers in the diner. He saw a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "Checkmate, Uncle Sal," Zoraide whispered, her voice a flat line of chilling finality. She pulled the trigger, and the blast caught Sal in the chest, the force lifting him off his feet and throwing him back into his velvet chair like a broken doll. The silence that returned to the room was heavy and absolute, broken only by the wailing of the silent alarm she had finally triggered. Zoraide scrambled through the wreckage to Jun-Ho, who was clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. "Jun-Ho," she cried, pressing her hands over his wound with a desperate bruising force. "Stay with me." He coughed, a pained, rattling sound, but a small smile touched his lips as he looked up at her. "You really hate bad tippers," he wheezed. Zoraide laughed through her tears, the adrenaline finally breaking. "Hold on, help is coming." He squeezed her hand, his grip weak but possessive. "I'm not going anywhere, Zoraide. We have work to do." 6 months after the fire and blood of the Onyx Lounge, the bell above the door of Miller's all-night diner jingled with a sharp, familiar chime. It was 2 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, and the weather was a perfect mirror of the night that had dismantled Zoraide Vance's old life. The rain hammered against the plate glass windows, turning the streets of South Boston into that same blurred smear of neon and charcoal that had once been the only world she knew. Mr. Miller looked up from the register, his face pale and eyes wide with the expectation of a drunk or a lost tourist, but he froze when he saw the woman who stepped through the door. She was wearing a cream-colored trench coat, tailored to a terrifying perfection, with diamond studs in her ears and heels that clicked with a rhythmic, lethal authority on the linoleum floor. It was Zoraide, but the invisible waitress he had fired was gone. Her hair was cut into a sharp, fashionable bob, and her eyes, once tired and dull, were now sharp, observant, and heavy with the weight of the city she helped rule. Behind her walked Jun-Ho, moving with a slight permanent limp, a souvenir from the bullet he had taken to shield her. He looked as dangerous as ever, his charcoal suit draped over a frame that commanded the air around him. Rocco stood by the entrance, his arms crossed and his presence effectively blocking the exit, turning the small diner into a temporary fortress. Miller stammered as he wiped sweat from his bald head, muttering about insurance companies and the liability he had once used as an excuse to cast her aside. Zoraide didn't look at the floor this time. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression a mask of chilling elegance. She noted that the place looked exactly the same, but Jun-Ho stepped forward to deliver the reality check. He placed a folded document on the counter, informing Miller that the building, the block, and the loan on Miller's house were now under new management. Zoraide placed a gloved hand on the counter, her voice dropping into that low, flat line of finality. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for pie. They sat in booth 4, the same torn red vinyl booth where Jun-Ho had first dismantled her with a look. The diner was empty, save for them, the hum of the fluorescent lights now sounding like a victory song rather than a soundtrack of despair. Miller served them with trembling hands, cherry pie and 2 coffees, black. Jun-Ho watched her take a sip of the bitter liquid, his espresso eyes full of a pride that transcended the business they ran. He asked if she missed the place, and Zoraide laughed, a soft, genuine sound that finally reached her eyes. She didn't miss the coffee, but she acknowledged that the diner was where she had finally stopped hiding in the shadows. Jun-Ho reached across the table, his scarred knuckles brushing against the platinum ring on her finger. He noted that the city was quiet, and with Sal Moretti gone and the families in line, they had finally achieved a peace. In the last 6 months, Zoraide had become the brain to Jun-Ho's muscle, known on the street no longer as a waitress, but as La Senora. She vetted the recruits, balanced the books, and smoothed over wars with a diplomacy that was more effective than any hit squad. The door jingled again, and a young man in a hoodie marched toward the counter, pulling a jagged, rusty kitchen knife on Miller. Zoraide didn't even stop drinking her coffee. She watched the boy's hands shake and noted to Jun-Ho that he was going to panic. When Jun-Ho reached for his jacket, she told him to stay put and drink his coffee. She stood up, her heels clicking as she approached the boy with an indifference that was more terrifying than a weapon. She told him to put the knife away, identifying it as a serrated bread knife, terrible for stabbing, and pointed out that his wide stance left him off balance. When the boy sneered, she dropped her voice into a dangerous whisper, informing him that he was making a mistake that would cost him the rest of his life. She nodded toward booth 4. The boy looked and saw Jun-Ho, the face of the nightmares that ruled the Boston underworld, watching him like a dead insect. The boy went white and dropped the knife, which clattered pathetically on the floor. Zoraide pointed to the door and told him to get a job, promising that if she saw him again, she wouldn't be as polite. The boy fled into the night, and Zoraide returned to the booth, picking up the knife with a napkin. Jun-Ho smiled, a true, possessive expression of love. She hadn't even used a cigarette this time. Zoraide leaned across the table and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of victory and the rain-slicked streets they now owned. She wasn't just holding the gun anymore. She was the queen who had finally taken her throne. Thank you for watching Mafia Diaries. For more daily Mafia stories filled with drama, suspense, and surprises, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Please don't forget to subscribe. Every subscription encourages me to tell more stories.